What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here, and it's time for League of Legends patch 12.4. I am 13 hours late on recording this. That's okay. Let's talk about it. Do not have public data on the various stat sites yet, so I don't know the actual results of the patch, but we've got a patch, so let's talk about it. Okay. Yeah, scroll on down. What do we got? We got the highlights. Nerfs to Blitzcrank. It doesn't really matter, but it's another patch where I don't know if it's not enough coordination or what, but ultimately, Blitzcrank's not getting nerfed because of pro, Veigar's not getting nerfed because of pro, Nunu's not getting nerfed because of pro. It's the kind of thing where, the publishing team or person or people, it's like at most two people I think usually. I was like, hey, so why is this character getting nerfed? Would like some context because obviously the publishing team puts together this, which is I think a great slide, and then like super happy they make this. But it's like why is Blitzcrank getting nerfed? Oh, he's actually too good at all skill levels. So like okay, and they just like check all four boxes on the I assume it's a Photoshop file or something, and pro play gets included. And it's like, no, Blitzcrank's not enough because of pro play. And for example, like Zeri's definitely getting nerfed because of pro play, right? That said, keep in mind that 12.4 must be a reaction to 12.2. By the time this was design locked, 12.3 pro play hadn't been seen. So as always, Riot kind of necessarily is going to be 2 weeks back on pro play. Just keeping that in mind for those who don't know. A big slew of buffs is pretty cool, and some I think pretty useful item changes that we'll talk about when we get to that point in time. Some cool skins. Also, Renata Glass is coming out. All pretty exciting stuff. This champion looks really, really cool. I'm definitely excited she's coming out. Should be really fun. All right, so first things first, Aatrox is getting buffed. Not by a ton. Keep in mind it's 1/15th more damage on the sweet spot. That's not a huge deal, right? It goes from dealing 1.5x to 1.6x, so 1/15th, unless I'm really trolling my math here, to the tune of around 7% more damage basically. It's worth noting, by the way, that Aatrox's winningest mythic by far is Stridebreaker. I believe that was also true before the AD itemization updates, because Gordricker didn't move all that much in the patch in 12.3, but Stridebreaker is like a 3% win rate jump for Aatrox. Turns out he actually does want attack speed to some degree. Turns out he already heals enough anyway. He doesn't need actually more of it in a lot of cases, because with his ult on, landing a Q, he's going to get a ton of health back anyway. The passive auto is going to get a ton of health back anyway, so it turns out he's actually happy with the Stridebreaker stat profile. Also, getting a guaranteed slow makes dodging Q3 basically impossible without some kind of dash or flash. And if they have that, Stridebreaker plus W guarantees the W pullback is going to happen even if they walk sideways. So there is a lot of gameplay around Stridebreaker. If you are listening to this video, watching this video, and you want to play some Aatrox, go Stridebreaker, trust me. Next up is a set of changes to Amumu, who is again, doing better in the high versus low elo skew ever since his ult became a stun and his Q got 2 charges. Both of those helped a lot in making him a bit more viable in higher elos. Still, though, Umu is ultimately too good, or always approaching too good for really high MMR, or sorry, really low MMRs, and basically unplayable for very high ones. So I like this change a lot. They are buffing Amumu's early game a ton. I think they could go even farther potentially, but the safer his early clear is, because keep in mind, like, everyone can clear camps at this point. No one's really in danger of dying to the jungle, but Amumu is in danger of getting killed by invades, right? Like when Xayah shows up level 3, what do you do except stun and then like walk away and then get knocked up yourself, right? So Amumu getting some early game skewed defensive stats, even more full health going through his jungle, a little bit more resilient to counter jungling, getting invaded upon and attacked. So what's going on with Amumu? Well, here's the amount of damage blocked by his E before and after. Note that I am not tracking the bonus armor MR here, which happens sometimes but not always. The amount of flat damage blocked, obviously, you can see where it shifts around. And keep in mind that it no longer can block the entire hit, which doesn't matter for jungle monsters, can matter for things like Zeri Q. Either way, yep, here he is, and a buff to Amumu. Which again is early game skewed, and early game tends to be high MMR skewed, so this helps Amumu in the spots he needs the help the most. Next up, a really interesting buff to Ashe. I think this is a really cool change list. The R moves faster as it moves, which obviously is not how physics work, but it's a magical arrow, so who cares? It's enchanted. I think this is really, really neat. I think this is a really cool buff. It is really hard to say if this is a very big buff or not. It's just not something that's really reliably knowable, so we'll see, but this is really, really cool, and I'm excited about it. Next up is Blitzcrank. Again, the thing at the very top said nerfed for all bands of skill. Ultimately, we know Blitzcrank tends to be a somewhat early game focused champion. He's a pretty high first blood rate, not quite as high as Pyke. Pyke is the highest champion I have seen in first blood rate, but Blitzcrank obviously is a good early laner, right? Either the invade hooks or whatnot. But okay, generally speaking, Blitzcrank, there's this interesting tension, Blitzcrank against ranged champions. Now, Blitzcrank against Leona is just like Leona face tanks for the Ashe or whatever, and, you know, with Aftershock, she's going to be fine, and you just kind of like scrap with the Blitzcrank, and it works fine, which is ironic because he's already scrapped, but that's a TFT joke, huh? Anyway, the interesting tension in bot lane with range supports, though, is how much can they harass Blitzcrank between hooks or when the wave is in a spot where he can't hook, and how much can Blitz then make his presence known in the spots where he can go for the play, right? When the minions are thinned out or he's got control or whatever else, and how long does a health bar last? And so my experience playing around Blitzcrank with a range support, aka one who can't just tank the hook and play the team fight, or play the 2-on-2 or whatever, is the tension around Blitzcrank's health bar. So I think this is actually a very interesting change because I think this is a very meaningful stat in a lot of Blitzcrank's lanes. We'll see how much it actually matters for him, but a small nerf here nonetheless. Next up, we have Dr. Mundo getting a couple sets of changes here. Attack damage growth down by 0.7, and his ultimate cooldown no longer scales with rank. This is ultimately a pretty small set of changes. One thing to point out is Dr. Mundo's E gives him flat bonus AD based on rank, and then gives him more based on how low health he is. So Dr. Mundo's real attack damage is much higher than it appears in the tooltip. Even if it was this one, 61 to 120 is not abysmally low for a melee champion. It's not high by any means, but oh, we have actually, let's crank stats real quick. Sorry about that one, but he's down 12 health per minute, 1 health per 5. That's true at all points in time, so here's a scaling difference down from 12% to down 5%, and we can move on. Though with Dr. Mundo, we have this data table here. On the left-hand side is his total AD counting ranks in E, which I believe scales 15 to 35, something like that. Maybe it's 10 to 30, but I mean, we can check, right? It goes from 61, okay, yeah, so 15 to 35. And you can see here that, okay, yeah, he has 76 base AD as soon as you put a rank in E, which is probably at level 2. And then he scaled to 200 and, you know, was 167, now 156 base AD, base slash bonus, I guess, but they're all the same for him. He doesn't have any AD ratios that I can think of. So either way, you know, does quite well regardless, has a lot of attack damage anyway. And so this is actually similar to the Volibear changes a while back when Volibear had worst in class attack damage. Keep in mind that part of Volibear's power is his passive, which shoots out Chain Lightning. Much like how Dr. Mundo has his E passive that gives him bonus AD, Volibear has a passive that shoots out Chain Lightning, which is functionally on hit damage, which is in a lot of cases functionally raw AD. Not quite, but similar to, which means that in a lot of these cases, you know, these champions have, you know, high, medium, or low AD, but there's more on hit effects afterwards, so you have to like further inflate that stat. I think it's fine that these Juggernaut types, right, Volibear and Dr. Mundo, have incentivized to auto attack. I think their combat patterns are healthiest when they're auto attacking a lot. It means that you have interest in getting an attack item at some point. Item like a Wit's End or a Stride Breaker, something like that, I think is actually very interesting, very cool. Blade of the Ruin King, Trinity Force, these are possibilities. I think that's always really, really neat when these champions have that pull of going for a squishier, more offensive item. As long as there's actual tension there, and that they are meaningfully squishier when they make that choice, but it can be worthwhile when they want to really scrap with someone. I think that's really great. I think it's actually a very big positive, such that we know, for example, Darius really likes early attack speed. He optimally runs the attack speed stat shard because he really, really wants to get several autos out because he wants to stack his passive. Because there's only one W, there's only one Q, the rest is all auto attacks, which means he really wants attack speed, and that's great. I think it's actually really powerful and really good that Juggernaut types want attack speed. Mordekaiser's in this case as well, where if he can't land Q and E, he needs to land autos to get his passive stacked up. And he has a free Lichbane or a free Nashor's Tooth with like a 40% AP ratio just on hit. I think it's all really cool stuff. So fan of the change overall. I think it's fine. Dr. Mundo has plenty of attack damage to spare. Ult cooldown doesn't change by a ton, of course, but you know, a late game focused nerf. To my understanding, Dr. Mundo is already an early game focused champion, so he's even more early game skewed, which doesn't have to be a problem. Just noting that it is the case here. Last I checked, I don't have the data here in the spreadsheet for this rundown. Next up is Illaoi, who is gaining substantially better base attack speed. Now, to my understanding, this should affect her level 1 attack speed as well. The way she is right now is her ratio and indeed level 1 attack speed is both 0.571. I am expecting these are both going to 0.625. Otherwise, there's very little change in the champion otherwise, because she doesn't tend to buy attack speed, and her attack speed growth as a champion is very, very, very low. In addition to the attack speed buff, which isn't that big in the first place, but going to be somewhat meaningful. Her W is going to deal more max health damage. Worth noting, this is a total AD ratio, meaning that the actual base damage ability is already going from like 4.7 to 7.9%. That's the kind of math we're seeing here. 1 second, gonna pause, see you in a second. And we are back, so let's look at the numbers. First things first, Illaoi's attacks per second are up by 9%. Again, worth noting that her attack speed growth is very, very low, so she still ends at below 0.9 attacks per second. She's certainly not a fast attacker, but if there's a world where you are going to go 24, so you are going to go Stridebreaker, I doubt they exist, but in case that was going to happen, you're getting also, in a way, your appetite for increasing base attack speed, or your appetite for increasing auto attack damage, is up by 9%. You're getting it already, but continued investment will also be up 9%. So Illaoi's ability to be an auto attacker is 9% better, which means there is a chance you skew a bit more toward being an auto attacker as a champion and a little bit less caster based. Again, 9% more auto DPS is not irrelevant, so there's a chance this starts to matter. If, for example, her E works with Trinity Force, so that if she pulls out Test of Spirit and gets to whack it like a champion and actually gets, her 24% or whatever more base AD, that's pretty meaningful because her base AD is very, very high, and this can be pretty useful. So there's a case here that it's worthwhile. I'm not sure it's going to really happen, but we can always look at data down the line. Keep in mind, Illaoi is rather unpopular, and so looking at an unpopular champion and then trying to dig into an unpopular build, aka Trinity Force Stridebreaker, is going to be really tough. It's unlikely we're going to find anything concrete for a while, but there is a very small chance she shifts her build slightly. I don't think it's likely, but there is a chance it happens. As far as the actual W damage, this is not counting her the auto attack itself. This is just the value of the W spell. Worth noting that, and of course, it causes a tentacle slam. Now, if they dodge it, you get no damage from the tentacle slam, of course, but that is part of the function of the W. But worth noting that, yeah, how many people had the bet that, oh yeah, this 4.5% max health damage ability is, 27 damage, right? Because 500 max health, 1% of that is 5, 4% of that is 20. Yeah, right. Like, this ability does not deal much damage early on, but it does deal a lot later on. Now, this is also counting expected bonus attack damage from buying a bunch of fighter items. So this is using her base AD and her expected bonus AD, and the fact that the AD ratio itself has doubled means that we, asymptotically approach 200% of the damage of the ability before. Worth noting that our highest point is level 13 because we haven't ranked up W yet, considering the rank up on W is only 0.5% max health per rank, which isn't very good. Yeah, we're not seeing anyone max that for pretty obvious reasons. Okay, next up we get to look at the buffs to Kalista. So Kalista is gaining 3 armor, pretty flat change here. That equates to about 2% more durability against physical damage, 2.5% to 1.6% based on level. Okay, great, nothing too special. Next up is Lucian. As we scroll up very slightly, Lucian is getting a slight scaling mana cost buff, so 2 to 10 mana off Piercing Light. This will tend to be pretty early game focused. Very, very, very early inning phases, of course, not going to be affected by this quite as much. Typically, you're going to learn rank 2 Q at level 4. So the first few levels, you get 2 mana off for the first 3 Qs or so, and it's not a very big deal. But yeah, as we move on, we get towards level 9 Lucian, and we get a pretty much far more meaningful mana cost change. So here we go, 2 to 10 mana off the ability. A solid 10% off the mana cost later on. You're going to feel a little bit. It's going to be a nominal buff to Lucian. Again, pretty early game focused. This can free up some builds. There's a chance we can go off of Essence Reaver on the champion. Possibly, I'm not sure that's going to be right or not, but fewer mana constraints means a chance to not buy mana items, which means you can theoretically greed for more aggressive offensive options. Is there a better option than that Essence Reaver based on his cooldown pattern? Maybe not, but worth a thought. Nami gets a revert on the E buff, or sorry, the E nerf from the previous patch. This still ends up being a flat 15 damage off of her at all points in time. Fair enough. Next up, we have changes to Neeko, which we will scroll down to now. So Neeko is getting, her hitbox has been dropped back down to appropriate for, I believe, a middle-sized champion. I could be wrong, but either way, she's going to be less hit by skill shots. That's not going to be a very big nerf, I don't think, or a big buff, I should say. But hey, it's happening. Just wanted to point that out. Her Q is getting more damage on the follow-up Q. Keep in mind there's one big hit and there's two small ones afterwards. Um, Yeah, that's the way it works. It's not small, small, big. It's big, small, small. I'm 90% certain of that one. Anyway, the AP ratio isn't changing any, but the base damage is increasing by 0 to 20. It's worth noting that the total AP ratio of this ability is actually only 0.9, and the total base damage of this ability is like 500, which now becomes 540, which means the AP ratio on Q is really, really, really abysmal on this champion. I would have preferred this ability getting a 0.25 AP ratio instead of 0 to 20 more damage on the ability. One thing, for example, is that Neeko, I think in a lot of times, has been a reasonably balanced champion, but without any pro presence, and usually this will happen a very little bit, and it's my belief that obviously some champions scale, and pro will still play some champions who scale. Azir being a good example. But my belief is that if you scale just based on getting levels, Rammus is an example of this one. You tend to be better in solo queue than in pro play. So let me say this in a different way, even though I said this topic a couple of times before. Early game tends to be high elo and pro focused. Yes, of course, early game is indeed high elo focused. Okay. However, where your late game comes from is relevant. If your late game comes from just ranking up and getting stronger abilities, that's going to tend to be lower elo skewed because anyone can sit in lane and get XP, right? Considering that there's going to be another champion you're against who's also trying to scale, right? And so if you scale just from leveling up, that's one thing. If you scale because your gold income is high, because you're good at last hitting, you're good at farming, you're good at catching waves and getting all the last hits there and getting high income, and your scaling comes from items that you buy, and your scaling comes from high AD and AP and bonus health ratios, those champions, their scaling, the scaling itself is pro skewed or high elo skewed because better players are better at last hitting, and so more of their power is in their items and not the base champion kit. Now, I didn't check this, so I could always be wrong, but my belief is that Neeko is going to be low elo skewed because she doesn't have very good gold ratios, right? She doesn't convert gold into power as well as a champion like Azir. And so through that belief, anytime I see a champion who isn't in pro in any way and is getting buffs that aren't to gold power, I tend to think that is very slightly missing the mark. Pretty minor thing, but one thing I wanted to bring up as a belief of something that I think could have been done a little bit better, but not a huge deal. I think even if I chimed in this change, there's a chance that nothing would have changed, but just what I believe to be true about the game doesn't mean it's actually true, but it's what I believe. Shape Splitter getting a flat 4 seconds off the cooldown, cool beans. So here is Neeko's Q damage before and after. Using an approximation for reasonable amount of ability power for a mage to gain. The base damage ability is in fact 182. Yes, it is. Goes up to a solid 7 to 800. Again, base 500 damage in the ability, or 540 as it becomes, with a 0.9 total AP ratio. Means that 400 ability power, you're gaining almost 3 to 400 damage. And so, of course, here are your numbers. Yep, cool. There's your math. 3 to 5% more damage in the ability. Not gigantic. And keep in mind, right, if they get out and only take Q1, it's 0 bonus damage. If they only take the first pop, it's half of whatever this number is. So 0 to 10 bonus damage, or sorry, 0 to 20, not 0 to 40. And the bonus damage is more like 1.5 to 3%. And then the W cooldown, W is max last. Theoretically, a flat cooldown reduction will shift towards wanting to max it earlier, though I don't believe this will shift people into maxing W second. It's a possibility. We know that, for example, attack speed on hit Neeko max W, because W had all the on hit damage, but that got front loaded into rank 1 of the ability, and so max rank W is not really a thing anymore. Fine, whatever. Next up, to the happiness of many solo queue players, Nunu is getting a nerf, and Nunu's getting a nerf in ways that will affect solo queue, and especially lower elo solo queue, more than will affect pro, and so it's a base stat focused scaling nerf. Mostly in the health growth, but a little bit in consume. Worth noting, though, that consume is also getting a bonus health ratio nerf as well. So it is somewhat also getting nerfed for people who can farm, but it's not a big deal because keep in mind, pro junglers tend to play a bit lower farm on champions like Nunu compared to, say, a Diana, where you're going to play for the Diana a little bit, or a Karthus, which we've seen in Academy and LCS somewhat. But here are our numbers. So here is Nunu's base health. And I want to point out that this is actually also using my estimated calculation for bonus health gained by a champion. So this is also counting what I expect Nunu to be buying or acquiring through runes and whatnot. and so his total health pool is down, 0 to 3% as time goes on. If you want to do the basic math for without items, he's down, 6 health scaling, so 100-ish, right? 1934 becomes 1832, so about 5% less health if you're not getting bonus HP. Pure AP death cap Nunu, I guess, rocket belt into who knows what. Although it's worth noting that things like Shadow Flame have health in them, so even that's going to be softened somewhat. Regardless, whatever. AP Nunu isn't as good as Tank Nunu, so I don't care. The actual heal is down by 25% flat against champions. It does say specifically against champions, so I assume the minion monster damage is not going anywhere. Fair enough, makes sense. Not a problem there, but yep, there's the math. Okay, great. Next up is Qiyana. Now, I did not math this one, I want to point out, but Qiyana passive is now going to do less damage, and I like this. They are lowering the bonus AD ratio specifically, which is, again, a pro and high elo focused nerf. Makes sense to me. I think they could have probably dropped down the early additional physical damage a bit as well, made this 5 to 83 or something. Not that important, but, would have been a possibility. Nerfing her somewhat. It's worth noting, though, that Qiyana actually does have a scaling pattern, that she is the champion whose win rate actually does eventually climb with game time. She spikes really quickly early on, troughs at post 20 minutes, and then climbs back up. And so, interestingly, a scaling focused nerf can in fact push Qiyana back into you're really only an early game champion. They could try to find ways to nerf Qiyana in lane as well. Again, early passive damage could be part of that. But she has an interesting U-shaped power curve. And so this gets rid of some of the late game power curve. It's worth noting, by the way, that her passive damage works on auto, but also gets applied on her Q, I believe. I'm pretty sure you pick it up with W, and then when you throw it out with Q, that actually gets applied to the damage output there. Yeah, that should hurt the wave clear because it won't be applying to her Q and whatnot. So late game burst damage definitely down to the tune of a 0.1 bonus AP bonus AD ratio, one that she's going to apply twice per combat because she's going to come with W charged, Q, W, Q, and she gets it twice. So this is pretty meaningful for optimized Qiyanas, aka high elo Qiyanas, and ones who earn a lot of gold, aka mid Qiyana. Big fan of the changes. Good job, Riot. Next up is Rumble. Rumble does not do terribly well in top lane. He's getting 5 base armor to make him look better in the top lane. I think he already has below 30 base MR to try to balance out the top versus mid win rate. I'm a big fan, actually, of armor MR skew to try to shift lane power around. I think that's actually pretty reasonable to do. I just wish Riot would set a budget for total armor MR and try to keep those relatively flat across champions so that when you look at a health bar, the health bar is relatively accurate. My example being Braum and Ezreal. A typical level 1 Ezreal will have more health than a typical level 1 Braum, but Braum has 2 more MR and 12 more armor than the Ezreal. Not even counting his W and E, which are active abilities, which I think is totally reasonable for those to work that way. But the idea that you look at the health bar and the health bar lies to you. And this is still not perfect because, for example, a 36 armor Rumble is going to look very different from a 21 armor Ezreal, or we saw in this patch, a 24 armor Kalista. Even if the rest of the numbers were kind of balanced out to some degree, I still would like that. Just, I think it's assuming that skewing armor MR is a good thing, which I think it is, I would like there to be one budget that armor and MR borrow from, and that way that they are shifted kind of in equilibrium. Either way, 5 armor is a pretty big buff. Here's his physical durability before and after. Worth noting that his armor doesn't scale all that much. It scales about as much as Kalista's does. It doesn't reach 100, which is fine. I think he is kind of a bruiser mage. That is kind of the playstyle of this champion. Ideally, his health growth and armor growth could be fairly high as a result. But again, 3.8 to 2.6% more physical damage taken. It's worth noting that this is both in burst and sustained cases. So, this is increased efficiency to the scrap shield because, that will block 60 damage after armor. Now, sometimes he won't take enough damage to block all that. Like if Jace autos once, scrap shield holds that auto attack anyway, and there's no change there. There are going to be cases where this literally doesn't do anything because the shield is going to fall off anyway. That is a real case. Cases where he wasn't going to take much poke anyway, and so who cares? He's going to fully sustain off of the door and shield regardless. That's going to happen to some degree, but this is still a pretty solid buff and cool to see. Next up is Sett. Sett is getting a scaling buff. Sett, I believe, is also somewhat early game skewed, but he's getting 7 health growth, which gives him a bit more late game durability. Keep in mind that his grit and all that stuff is going to scale off of his max HP. So a theoretically bigger shield, theoretically more damage out of the W, I believe is true. That might be wrong, but I believe that's accurate. Ultimately, either way, it is 119 more health by the end of the game, which is up to 5% more health overall. Now, in the case of Nunu, I included his typical build, or an estimation of a typical build, by giving him bonus HP. In the case of Sett, it's more difficult because a lot of the fighter items now are items like Blade of the Ruined King, Wit's End, Death's Dance. There is a suite of items, Maw of Mortius as well, and all 4 of these are completely reasonable common items for a fighter to buy. So there's a completely real case that Sett buys very little bonus HP. Yeah, he's probably still always going Stridebreaker, or maybe like a Turbo Chem Tank in some cases. So it's, not exactly perfect to skip all the health here, but Sett has a lot of builds that don't have a lot of bonus HP, and so I didn't include it in this calculation. It's a little bit less, of course, the more HP he buys. Then we have Veigar. Veigar is far, far too good in the bottom lane. So Riot's doing some very, very light shifting in pushing him a bit more toward a scaling pick, a bit off of the early game, and also armor should be a bot lane skewed stat, since Veigar can often be just against Ahri or Azir in mid, but he's gonna very frequently be against like Ashe or Draven in bottom lane. So armor can be a lot more powerful in nerfing him in the bottom lane. So here is Veigar's armor, aka physical durability, in the game state before and after. Break even point is level 11. Technically it's like 99.99% as durable at level 10, but it rounded. So yes, a very little bit more durability by level 11 onwards, but a large portion of the game is played in the early game. Veigar has, I believe, 30 base magic resist and 21 base armor, so he has a very, very low resistance budget, which is fine. I'm not complaining about it, but it does mean that Veigar's health bar is skewed very heavily towards magic damage, or towards surviving magic damage. Which is kind of left as its own thing, just kind of pointing it out, right? And then his E cooldown, E is the ability you're going to max second. Considering the cooldown incentive is actually further increased from 1.5 to 2 seconds per rank, you are even more likely to max at second. You are always leaving W as a 1-point wonder. That was going to be pretty obvious for almost everyone. But yeah, it does bring down his early game CC, his early game comboing, and his early game frailty. So, okay, nerfs to Veigar, specifically early game focus, specifically in lanes where he doesn't gain as much XP, aka bottom lane. So pretty smart stuff here. Xayah now scales her E fully with crit chance. So it scales exactly as well as her crit chance does. There was a time when Xayah's full caster builds were optimal. We're at a spot here where Caitlyn's in a similar boat as well, actually. And that can be, I don't think it's necessarily a problem that if Caitlyn can be a caster. And I think it's actually good that AD carries can fall back on caster patterns. But the more I've looked at League of Legends, the more I actually like the idea of spells like Blade Caller and Caitlyn Q and Caitlyn R scaling off of base AD, total AD, allowing your level ups to scale the ability, because, hey, we max Caitlyn Q first, hey, we max Xayah E first. Wouldn't it be nice if it could keep going in case I'm not doing well? I have a fallback skill that can do something. I'm generally a fan of total AD scaling on abilities. It has some considerations around them being better mid laners, because mid laners level up more, so there's some waffling there that can be a concern, and you can have some class skew that way you don't actually want, or lane skew that you don't actually want. Mid Tristana being an example. Mid Tristana, by the way, only bonus AD on the E, but people are still afraid of mid Tristana overtaking bot Tristana. But anyway, the idea though that, hey, well, crit chance can also scale my ability means that if Xayah stops to go buy a Hurricane second, she's actually still scaling up Blade Caller. I think that's actually a good thing. I'm actually a fan of that. So kind of cool to see this. I think it's a good buff. Xayah is one of my favorite champions. Even before her last 3 sets of buffs, I played her a fair bit in Clash, felt pretty good about it against dive comps. I think she's a cool champion, so good to see some buffs. Because, yeah, it's I like when champions that I enjoy are strong. Next up is Zeri, getting a whole suite of nerfs and also trying to shift her toward crit builds. This is basically patch 2 trying to shift Zeri. I think it's good follow-up work so far. I have no major complaints here. So let's talk about it sort of one at a time. So the basic uncharged basic attack is doing much less early damage, but is going to be slightly better at last hitting. If they're below 35% health, they do bonus damage. So here is the first set of numbers here. Worth noting, the AP ratio went from 4% to 3%, so down 25%. Let's compare what those mean. The AP ratio nerf is less than the base damage nerf, right? So the base damage nerf is down by about 1/3 at all points in time. 15 becomes 10, 40 becomes 25, pretty close to 1/3 at all points in time. Again, only 25% off the AP ratio, so AP Zeri theoretically is a play here. And as far as this is concerned, not a huge difference, but as we multiply it out, ultimately doing 5x the damage, right, 50 to 125 instead of 45 to 120, a very, very slight help with last hitting minions. So weaker Zeri players can do a little bit better at last hitting minions, and I mean, this is remotely similar to a champion's base AD growth. Not quite there, like it would have to be shifted a bit more early game for this to happen, but whatever, it's not a big deal. Anyway, right, better at hitting low health things, which means, by the way, this also works against towers. So if you have a tower below 35%, pretty worthwhile to use this auto attack damage. As far as the charged basic attack, the slow is a little bit weaker early game, but a little bit better later on. Although with the slow duration going down, it's pretty much never as good. Losing 0.5 instead of losing 0.6, it's always a worse slow. I want to point out that I didn't actually graph this, so whoopsies, but yeah, overall less CC for charged basic attacks. Less of a nerf for hitting uncharged ones. Okay, next up is Burst Fire. Burst Fire is getting 1 to 5 damage off the ability baseline, which does technically lower its need to rank up, though it's still going to be maxed first, as far as I can tell. Also worth noting, though, that now crits are going to apply to its base damage. That's pretty meaningful. Also, something that I think should have been loosened even more heavily, it hasn't just yet, but I think really should be, and I'm glad it's at least going this direction, is Zeri, much like we see with champions like Yasuo and whatnot, excess attack speed to AD conversion. This is still gold inefficient. In general, I guess there can be fear over items like Phantom Dancer being too good. I don't know if things like Lethal Tempo end up converting into too much attack damage, and that can be too scary as well. So it might be that this is like a safeguard for really weird optimizations. And that's actually maybe completely reasonable. But one thing that happens with any kind of like Kraken Slayer build with Berserker Greaves and, you know, generic crit optimization tends to have a lot more attack speed than bruiser optimization. And if your excess attack speed conversion is trash, aka both pre and post patch, you are shooting yourself in the foot by doing crit optimization, because eventually your items are just 20% less gold efficient than they should be, and the item is just suddenly trash. You know, the fact that your auto attacks literally have this flat damage on top that cannot crit, that cannot scale off anything but armor pen, and getting to the 1.5 attacks per second breakpoint means that why buy crit? Why buy attack speed? Why buy these items when I don't get anything out of it? So I'm glad that this is getting softened so that it can now crit. I'm glad this is getting softened so that these builds don't shoot you in the foot quite as much. I would like to see it go more maybe towards like 70%, but whatever. Either way, let's look at the math here. So here is Zeri's Q damage because of the 1 to 5 damage off. Using an approximation for how much AD she normally buys, you can see it's a pretty flat, 1 to 2 to maybe even 2.5% off the damage at the worst point in time, but not that bad. However, if the ability crits, even accounting for the nerf, the ability does about 2 to 4% more damage. So the question is, how often am I critting? At level 9, when I'm at one item, I lose 5 damage, but I might gain 15 damage. Okay, well, that's cool if I crit 1 out of every 4 attacks, right? Well, that's 25% crit chance, which means I need to be at 2 items. So basically at 2 crit items, once we're at 2 crit items, this is now a buff to Zeri. If we're not at 2 crit items, it is a nerf to Zeri. Of course, if we're never buying crit items, it's always a nerf to Zeri, but worth noting that you indeed do soften the blow by building crit chance. So cool change, because I think closing the gap is wise. I'm a big fan of that one. Ultra Shock Laser. These sets of changes on the W and the E are going to basically close the gap between W max and E max second. So the W is going to give you 10% slow per rank, and a cooldown incentive on the slow. Spark Surge is going to have less of a cooldown incentive and less of a cooldown refund on attacking and landing abilities. So here is the W total slow before and after. It used to slow 50% of your total move speed up to 1.4x your total movement speed in terms of like the amount of distance you are denied. And now it's, worse early game, but by the time you max it out, and just for ease of comparison, I'm assuming that a W max second in the new world here. Is that going to be accurate and reasonable? I don't know for sure, but it's certainly a possibility. And it just, it kind of just makes the breakpoints easier to identify, that, these are the points where the heavy lifting is being done. And yeah, there's the changes here. And as far as the cooldown's concerned, similar boat here where, once you have maxed out W, it's actually a better ability, right? The slow is overall as good. The cooldown is shorter. It's overall a better ability. So W is less of a 1-point wonder. I think that's great, right? I think that's actually a positive thing. It's worth noting that in Zeri's Bruiser builds, she is basically a one-item spike champion who slowly falls off with time. I mean, unsurprisingly, Bruiser items don't exactly self-multiply all that well, which is okay. It's fine. You know, we just go Trinity Force, Titanic into Cleaver, and, you know, we feel pretty comfortable. Cleaver got buffed. I assume that was actually a buff to Zeri as well in the previous patch. I didn't check very closely, though. But all that stuff is pretty relevant. And so now, you know, the more rank of incentives we have, well, okay, the more we can kind of tease out some late game power, right? And make her less of a one spike wonder because, well, you know, the base cooldown is now 30 instead of 10. The base slow is 30 instead of 50. Now she's much less powerful, levels 2 through, you know, 8 or whatever, right? So I think it's actually pretty relevant. So anyway, Spark Surge gets the cooldown incentive dropped as well. And the 1.5 becomes 1 second per hit. So what does that mean for us? Well, once again, assuming the world of maxing E second, which I know is a little fraudulent, but whatever. You know, yep, here's the cooldown difference. You know, and it's not gigantic, right? You know, from this part of the table on the left-hand side here, it's not that big of a change. So, you know, does it really matter all that much? And the answer is actually kind of it does. So this is taking these numbers again and saying, well, what if we hit 6 times? You know, because if we're gonna, you know, hit a champion once per second, which is a reasonable-ish thing to do, it's like, well, by the time we max it out, you know, we press E, we hit 6 times over the course of 6 seconds, and 6, you know, well, the actual cooldown of the ability is really 8 seconds, which means it's up 2 seconds after my 6 seconds of combat, and I'm ready to E again. I'm ready to dash again. I'm ready to get my pierce again, whatever it is, right? Like, we're ready to go. We're ready to rock. And obviously, you know, if your W hits, if you know, there's all these kind of things that can refund. So, you know, 6 hits. This is, we made up a number and said, why don't we pick 6 hits as our example? And it's worth comparing then right? Okay, the cooldown's 2 seconds long. That's not a very big deal, but the cooldown refund is a lot longer, is a lot worse. So, you know, I press my button, I get in combat for a while. Okay, it's back up in 2 seconds, right? After 6 seconds, 6 hits. Well, now it's up in 7 seconds after 6 seconds, 6 hits. That's a very big difference, right? That at that point, it's very meaningfully different here. It's like, oh, okay. And this is going to be the bigger change, right? And so because this refund is so much weaker now, you don't really care about the base lane cooldown being shorter, right? Because, right, that's the difference, you know? I mean, you know, imagine this was 8 versus 10, right? 8 versus 10 is enough where you're like, yeah, I really care about that, right? Again, imagine our 6 second, 6 hits situation where we have 2 seconds to go or 4 seconds to go, right? Twice as long at that point in time. Yeah, I'm kind of picking an arbitrary time that's really, you know, making this case for me. Not all cases are like this, but, right, 2 versus 4 is a really big change. No longer are you going to get those kind of returns on this ability because you're just not going to have, it's not going to be that stark anymore. So, you know, an 8 second cooldown become a 10 second cooldown, yeah, is now a 13 second cooldown, and, you know, versus a, 17 second cooldown, right? So, yeah, not as important. So we might see E not max second. Certainly W second versus E second is going to get a lot closer, and that's going to be pretty meaningful to look at. Certainly crit build versus bruiser build is going to get a lot closer. That's going to be meaningful to look at. Finally, her late game is going to go down a little bit. I don't think this was maybe a necessary change. Again, to my understanding, she was more of an early game focused champion with her optimal builds. But whatever. I mean, it's a nerf. I think Zeri needs to be nerfed. I think this is an okay place to nerf. I mean, literally every ability got hit in some way. You know, the passive, whether it's the uncharged damage or the charge slow, Q got hit, W got hit, E got hit, R got hit. Worth noting, though, that crit Q did get buffed. And pretty much strictly, right? Like, crit Q pretty much outside of the early game got strictly buffed. Now, there's an argument that, you know, that's meaningful, but I mean, she lost 1 to 5 damage, which isn't that huge, but she gained 15 damage on crits, which is, I think, pretty relevant. And then, you know, the rest of it, of course, you know, these are still nerfs to crit build. So we'll see what it turns into, but I think these are some pretty interesting changes. I think the builds get closer together, which is great. I think very, very smart. A couple other small things we can look at. You can ping your allies' cooldowns to look at their item cooldown specifically. I think it's really cool. Rejuvenation bead is no longer going to allow you to do the 3 rejuve bead start. That one is gone. It's just double sized now. It's a 300 gold rejuve beads. You can buy bead plus a refillable. You can buy bead plus some potions, whatever. That's all well and good, but you can't do the triple bead start. It's basically now you can double bead start. However, if you double bead start, you lose out on refund. So instead of buying 3 and getting 315 back, aka you only spent 135 gold on triple rejuve bead, which is pretty good, right? This costs you less than 3 potions to go triple bead. You are now spending 300 gold, getting only 180 back. You're paying 180 for a double bead, right? So instead of your total loss being 135, 135 to triple bead, you are paying 180 to double bead, right? And so, double bead because rejuve is twice the size now. So that's pretty meaningful, right? I think that's actually a pretty significant change in that build's viability. It still may be correct to go rejuve plus refillable, but it is like a lot of regen and a little abusive, so I'm just kind of glad to see it. Crystal Embracer overall gets changed around with this change. Knight's Vow gets to be a stronger item. Now it's got a Crystal Embracer that's a bit larger, and it's just like, yeah, screw it, here's just have some more health regen. Knight's Vow is the same total cost, whatever. Okay, sure, great, you buffed an underperforming item, that's fine. That is like a lot of health regen, of course, but that's fine, who cares? Warmog's, Crystal Embracer is larger, so okay, great, nothing too huge there. And then finally, systems changes to basically playing Smite support top. Okay, so gold value bounties, aka CS bounties, are now based on the number of support gold incomes on the enemy team. So basically the way it worked, right, is if you were farming better than everyone else, or, well, more specifically, if you were farming better than the average of the top 4, you by a substantial amount, you would accrue a bounty by getting a lot done by split pushing. Now, if you're farming better than everyone who didn't buy a support item, which means that you're not going to accrue a CS bounty because it's a Qiyana top. Okay, good change, right? Just like that's going to feel good. Next up, objective bounties. Objective bounties are now significantly less likely to lead to objective bounties if there are 2 or more support gold income items on your team. So the value of a gold lead is going to be crushed if it says, oh, I see more than 1 spell thieves. Okay, I'm going to heavily devalue what a gold lead means when putting objective bounties on. Now, in both of these cases, I think bounties were not hugely important in terms of the AFK top lane strategy. These were not the reason these strats worked, to my understanding. Now, it's worth noting that from what I looked at, and to be fair, there's only so many games of Qiyana top. At least last I looked about a week or so ago, there were only so many games, but it tended to be a scaling pick, where if you got out of the early game, and this could be player behavior things, right, where, the Qiyana screws up, the play goes wrong, your mid laner just AFK open mid, your strat sucks, like, there are behavioral biases in public data, right? So there's a really good chance that all the FF at 15, FF at 20 is because of things like that, and it actually isn't early game strategy. That's possible here, but the win rate tended to go up and to the right. So there is a chance that the bounties were some small portion of this, and keep in mind, like, if all this does is lower the champion's win rate by 2%, the strategy is down 2% win rate, that's actually a really, really meaningful hit, right? In 2 out of 100 games, bounties no longer, right, like, that makes the difference. It only has to be that small, right, for this to like really change things around. Because as far as I can tell, top Qiyana's win rate is not that much higher than bot Qiyana's win rate, and things like top Karma didn't seem to be winning any more than any other champion. So I don't think this strategy is overwhelming for most players in solo queue. And then finally, one more change to the item in general. It's already pretty much unpoachable for laners in the first place, but receive diminishing gold for excess minion kills. Instead of being 4 minutes per minute, it's 2 minutes. It's 2 minutes per minute for the very early game. And then it switches up. However, it also starts counting. Actually, did they change the counting thing? Okay, interesting. So there's a version of this where they said it counts from the time minions crash, but I believe that would have really punished, a Xayah support or a brand who happened to get a couple CS and just gets nothing for it. So that might be gone. I'm not sure, but it's now more severe in the very beginning of the game. So if you are taking, the full first few waves, you really, 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 really get nothing. Sure, there's the 1 out of 100 games where your AD carry doesn't connect or gets first blooded in the very first wave, and you're going to take farm as Xayah, and you might get punished for this a little bit. But like, I don't know. I don't think it's that big of a deal regardless. And then one nice change as well is objective bounties now fall off much, much faster. Part of the reason the bounties did linger for 15 seconds, and in fact could also linger in combat, was early feedback of the system where players essentially got confused or annoyed that the bounties would fall off. Like, but I was killing this turret for a bounty. Like, yeah, we got 1 gank off. So we went from down 6k to down 5k. Why can't I cash in this bounty anymore, right? And that was like some of the frustration, and that's fairly relevant. But ultimately, it's like, you know what, screw it. Your bounty fell off. You're not far enough behind anymore. 5 seconds is maybe enough time to cash in and get more done, but ultimately, hey, if you got back over the break point, goodbye. And I think that's fine. I mean, whatever, right? If players just come to understand how bounties work and are okay with them falling off, I think it's reasonable. But I think, I can go either way in this one. It does make bounties a little bit less impactful in the game. And that's the patch. So TLDR patch 12.4. It's a pretty big patch, but a lot of bite-sized changes. Let's talk about it. Renata Glask is coming out. Really cool champion. Looking forward to her a lot. Aatrox is going to do 1/15 more damage on Q sweet spots. Looks pretty cool there. Amumu is getting an early game focus buff to make him survive his jungle clear and survive early invades a bit more. This should help slightly shift him upwards in high elo, where he needs the help mostly. Ashe ult is now going to move faster as it moves, which is really, really interesting and really, really cool. I'm looking forward to playing with that. Blitzcrank gets a little bit less health regen, mostly skewed towards the early game. This is 12% less health regen, basically, which is pretty moderate, pretty meaningful, and should tap his win rate down a little bit. Dr. Mundo gets much less attack damage growth, overall 12 less AD, and also is losing his rank up incentive for cooldown on the ultimate. Ultimately, Dr. Mundo still gets 15 to 35 free attack damage through E ranked, which he maxes second, and so still has very, very high total attack damage, but is going to be down somewhat. Illaoi has 9% more base attack speed, and her W damage is going to be up around 50% actually in a lot of ports of the game. So that's going to be pretty meaningful actually, and should be pretty meaningful. The early game damage ability is very, 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 very low, but by mid game it really kind of picks up and is going to be substantially stronger at that point in time. Illaoi is probably getting buffed pretty meaningful here. It's a couple hundred extra damage in a combo. Kalista gets 3 armor, which is about 2% more durability against physical damage. Lucian gets 2 to 10 off of his mana cost, which is pretty nice. Nami is getting a revert on the E nerf, so 15 more damage on her combo, on buffing a teammate. Neeko ultimately gets up to 40 bonus damage on Q, which is pretty meaningful. Worth noting that Q's AP ratio is very, very low relative to its base damage, and so somewhat lends itself towards bruisery or magic pen focused builds. W's cooling down by 4 seconds is pretty cute. Shouldn't mean a ton, but maybe is going to be a little bit more active in terms of being able to scout brushes and whatnot, which is pretty useful. Nunu loses a solid 6 scaling health and also loses about 25% off, actually exactly 25% off of the Q heal. AP ratio nerfed a similar amount, so okay, pretty big hit there, great. Qiyana is losing some bonus AD ratio on her passive, which applies on an auto attack or on a Q. This is a gold scaling focus nerf, which should mostly hit her late game in really high MMR, which I think is a cool change. Rumble is getting a full 5 base armor, which is pretty meaningful. Should do a lot for his ability to scrap with people in top lane. And overall seems like a really positive change. He's definitely not doing too well in top lane, and I think him having some more good matchups is interesting because I think Rumble top is a really cool champion. Sett is getting 7 health growth, which gives him a full 2300 base health level 18, which is quite high. But ultimately, Sett tends to be more early game skewed, and as far as I can tell, could use the buffs a bit. So there you go. Veigar is getting some very small changes to try to shift him a little bit out of bot lane, a bit towards mid lane, because ultimately he is far too good in bottom lane, and that is just kind of not okay. So 2 base armor off, armor growth up a very little bit. Ultimately, this is a buff at level 11, which basically makes him play through the entire early game, taking increased physical damage. Not by a ton. A 2 armor nerf is not a very big deal. It's 1.5% less durability roughly, but matters a little bit. You're a little bit more killable in the bot lane. Shifts it down a very, very little bit, but this is kind of a love tap. The bigger change is Event Horizon has a 2-second longer cooldown until you can rank it up. This is the ability you max second. You will still max it second. And so by level 13, it is the same ability, but before then, it is going to be weaker. So ultimately, Veigar is getting 2 different small nerfs to his early game, which should definitely bring him down in bot lane a little bit, maybe to the tune of 1.5%. Xayah is getting a buffed crit ratio on her E, which is great. I think it's actually very powerful to allow that ability to keep scaling and do well with crit. Blade Color is still the primary thing for Xayah. It is the most important part of her kit, and it's going to do a lot more damage. Now, it goes from doing 1.5x to doing 1.75x. Keep in mind that this is not going to be really gigantic. It's even at full crit build, 15% more damage. It's not huge, but it is some more damage, and that's cool. Zeri is getting a big set of changes that are going to shift her out of Bruiser and toward crit. I wouldn't say out entirely, but sort of toward that direction. It's going to close the gap on those builds a little bit. This is just a straight nerf. Overall, less damage against high health targets, and overall a little bit more damage against low health targets. The base damage decreases about 1/3 off, and the AP ratio nerf is 1/4 off. So theoretically, less nerfed on AP Zeri. Charge basic attack slow, pretty substantially weaker. From 30 becomes 14, and 60 becomes 50. Early game focus nerf, a lot less CC. Burst Fire overall does a little bit less damage. 5 to 15 less damage is not gigantic. However, that base damage can now crit, which is going to be pretty meaningful. Ultimately, it's 1 to 5 less base damage, but now it can crit. So this means 1 to 5 less damage, but this becomes 15 more damage if the ability crits. Once you're at max rank of the ability. It's pretty meaningful. Bonus getting extra attack speed is less of a trap, though it's still quite bad, still quite gold inefficient, and so still a bit rough for our girl. And then finally, we have a change that shifts Wmax towards, or Emax toward Wmax. It might not close the gap entirely, but it's going to shift her toward Wmax being a possibility. Second, specifically, I think we still max Q first in all cases. But the slow is going to be as good at rank 5, and there's now a cooldown incentive that is as good at rank 4. So much worse than 1 Wonder. Definitely a lot more incentives to rank this ability up. Meanwhile, Spark Surge is losing some cooldown incentives by getting less cooldown per rank up, or less reduced cooldown per rank up, less meaningful there. And then also the cooldown reduction per attack is going to be less, which is also going to further make you care less about lowering the base cooldown. In general, I think it's actually accurate how that works. So far fewer spark surges, which means we don't care about the pass-through damage being better because we don't get to cast as much. We don't care about the cooldown getting lower because we can't refund it nearly as much anyway. All that's pretty meaningful. And then a small late game nerf with Lightning Crash giving less bonus attack speed. These are all some pretty big, it's a lot of like small to medium nerfs in a lot of directions, but Zeri is far too strong. So I think a pretty good set of changes. Zeri is going to get pretty close to 50% win rate off of changes like this. I think this is a good number of mid-sized changes that put her in a pretty decent spot overall. A couple last things to talk about is the rejuvenation bead is now twice as expensive for twice as much regen, but it sells back for a lot less gold, so the triple rejuve bead start is dead. If you want to still do a single rejuve bead start, which is akin to a double rejuve bead start of old, you're getting a lot less gold back because you are basically now paying 180 gold for the honor of holding onto a rejuve bead for a while. Crystal Embracer, Knights Found, Warmogs all change around it, nothing too meaningful there. And then finally, support gold items are going to give fewer bounties. Objective bounties are going to care about team gold leads a lot less, and champions getting CS bounties are going to look at the fact that there's one fewer farmer, and they're going to look at the top 3 instead of the top 4 and use that as something meaningful. And then finally, objective bounties themselves are going to fall off much faster once you catch back up in gold. So overall, bunch of cool changes. Big fan of the patch. I think there's some really good housekeeping done here, and it's a fun patch. And so I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.